Welcome to the Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we're covering 2 Samuel chapter 16 through 1 Kings chapter 9. Last week we ended with David fleeing Jerusalem because his son Absalom had rebelled against him and was taking over the kingdom. So David had to hightail it out of town and take some of his people across the Jordan River, basically outside of Israel. In chapter 16, David is escaping Jerusalem and runs into a large number of people, some desiring to help him, some to curse him, and some to mock him. There's a guy by the name of Shimei, who is a relative of Saul, and he calls down curses on David and calls him a murderer and pelts him with stones. Abishai, who is the brother of David's general Joab, wants to kill Shimei, but David won't let him. He says, maybe the curses are from God himself. David seems to realize that this might be part of God's punishment for his adultery with Bathsheba and killing her husband, which of course it is. About this time, Absalom is entering Jerusalem and taking over. Now, one of David's advisors has switched his loyalty from David to Absalom, and that is Ahithophel. If you could pronounce that, Ahithophel. And now he is on Absalom's side. And the first thing he tells Absalom to do is to go and sleep with all of David's concubines. In other words, his contracted wives. So that people will know that Absalom is now the real king. This, of course, was forbidden, but Absalom didn't care and did it anyway. And he did it in a way that everyone in Jerusalem knew he was doing it. Now, interestingly enough, Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba, who David committed adultery with and had a child that died. So there seems to be a little payback going on here and a fulfillment of Nathan's words to David that what he did in secret will be done publicly to him. David has his own man on the inside, though, and that is Hushai, who tricks Absalom into thinking that he's on his side. Now, Hushai is there to confuse the advice of Ahithophel, who was actually very wise. So there's lots of intrigue going on right now here. In chapter 17, Ahithophel gives Absalom some very good advice. He says, take a small force of men and go and kill David before he gets prepared, and then the war will be over and David will be gone. Hushai is then asked by Absalom what he thinks. Hushai tells him the advice is bad. Instead, take his time and slowly build a large army, and then go fight David in a conventional war. Absalom thinks this is much safer, and so he takes Hushai's advice instead. This causes Ahithophel to go home and kill himself by hanging. This, of course, reminds us of Judas in the New Testament. Now, most scholars believe he did this because he realized that if Absalom followed Hushai's advice, well, Absalom was going to lose the battle. And then David would take over, and David would take his wrath out on Ahithophel for betraying him, which is probably what would have happened. In chapter 18, Absalom gets his troops together after gathering all these nations and gathering this large conventional army, and he appoints Amasa as his general. Now, Absalom attacks, but David and Joab are prepared by this time, and they are experienced warriors, and they make sure the battle happens in a forest where their small number of troops will have the advantage over Absalom's large number of troops. The result, David's men under Joab are victorious, and Absalom is killed. There is a point of controversy here because David has ordered that he not be killed, but Joab himself had killed him. And David will hold this against Joab just as he does the murder of Abner earlier. Well, when David finds out that his troops are victorious, but that Absalom has been killed, all David does is mourn. He finds no joy in the victory and does not congratulate or recognize his troops. This leads to his army going home in shame and Joab calling David out and telling him, you better get a grip on yourself and reward your men instead of crying over your dead rebellious son, or you're going to lose the army's loyalty and your kingdom yet again. Well, David finally does come to his senses, rewards his army, and then heads to Jerusalem to take it over again. He makes a crucial mistake, though. that will end up affecting the rest of Israel's history, in that he asked the tribe of Judah that they be the one to come and greet him and bring him into the city. This does not go over well with what is known as Israel, or the other 10 tribes, or what later becomes known as the northern kingdom. They protest this, and there is a confrontation between the men of Judah and the northern tribes. In the meantime, as David is coming into Jerusalem, he is pardoning his enemies. He runs into Shimei again. Remember the guy who was cursing him? And David forgives him. Or at least I should say he forgives him for now. In chapter 20, we find out that the Israelites are still angry, and a man by the name of Sheba leads them in a rebellion against David. Now David realizes he has to put this rebellion down fast. So he asks Amasa to gather the army of Judah. Now did you catch that he asked Amasa? Apparently David was done with Joab and was trying to get rid of him and his brother Abishai, because it was apparent to David that he could not control Joab. Joab went against all of his orders constantly and killed anyone he thought was a threat. Now, it can be argued when you look at who Joab killed that he was really actually just looking out for David's best interests. Abner was a general for the other side. Absalom, even though he was David's son, would have been a constant threat if Joab hadn't killed him. And it seemed that whatever advice Joab gave, it was pretty good for David in the end. But Joab is also a very deceitful character, and we'll see that time and time again too. He thinks about his own best interest most of all. Getting back to David's decision, though, to appoint Amasa. Remember, Amasa was the general that had just led the army against Israel. He had been Absalom's general, and he was a losing general who stupidly allowed his large army to be led into a thick forest and be defeated. One has to question David's wisdom in putting Amasa in charge. And then we find out Amasa isn't even able to gather an army from Judah. He had killed tens of Judeans in battle, so why would they follow him? So instead, David gets irritated by this, and he asks Abishai, Joab's brother, to do it, and he does. But then Joab brings his own army along too. Now David may have fired him, but Joab's troops are still following Joab. So Joab and Abishai get the armies together, and lo and behold, Amasa shows up. Joab goes up to him, and well, you guessed it, kills him. David never says a thing about it. So Joab leads the army, and they trap Sheba in a walled city. And here we run into another wise woman. Remember when we talked about the wise women last week? Well, this wise woman asks Joab what he wants. She says her city is a mother city, and people come to it for wisdom. Why would Joab want to destroy it? He says he doesn't. He just wants Sheba dead. The wise woman says, consider it done. And she has Sheba's head chopped off and thrown over the wall of the city to Joab, and the war's over. When we get into chapter 21, the author of the book seems to be listing some things that, well, he left out of earlier sections. Chapters 21 through 24 are kind of like an appendix to the book. He clears up some old business concerning some wrongs done to the Gibeonites by Saul by giving the Gibeonites some of Saul's relatives and letting the Gibeonites kill them. Remember from the book of Joshua, this was the tribe that tricked Israel into thinking they were a tribe from far away and not one within the promised land. But Israel had made a covenant with them, and Saul broke that. Then there was a war with the Philistines where David gets tired, and the army tells David he can no longer go to war with them because he's getting too old. Now this battle probably took place much earlier in history, probably even before Solomon's birth and Absalom's rebellion. I say that because David never fought in the war against Absalom or against Sheba. So we're not following an exact chronological order, as we said before in both 1st and 2nd Samuel. In chapter 23, there's a listing of David's greatest warriors and some of their exploits. The last one listed is pretty familiar to us, and that is Uriah the Hittite. That's who David killed and then took his wife Bathsheba. Think about that. David didn't just have one of his soldiers killed, he had one of his elite SEAL Team 6 guys killed. That's pretty sad. It also shows the extent of David's sin at that point. In the last chapter of 2 Samuel, David comes out of pride, takes a census of his nation, and God is displeased and punishes him for it. David, at the end of the chapter, buys land from a Jebusite to build an altar to stop the punishment that God is raining down because of David's sin. This will later become the exact place where Solomon's temple will be built. That takes us into 1 Kings chapter 1, where we find David in his old age, and he can't seem to keep warm, and so they give him a young woman to sleep with him to keep warm. It is said to be a purely platonic relationship, but strange. It is during this time that Adonijah, one of David's sons, takes advantage of this situation and sets himself up as king. Nathan and Bathsheba get wind of this, and they know that David wants Solomon to be king, and so they go before David and tell him what's going on. And David makes Solomon king. Adonijah finds out about this, realizes he's in real trouble because this will be looked upon as a rebellion, which in a sense it is. Solomon forgives him, though, and lets him go home. In chapter 2, David leaves some very interesting instructions for Solomon. He is concerned that Solomon is young and that people will challenge his authority, plus David, well, he wants some payback before he given out after he goes. So David tells him, Joab pulled a lot of stuff. Make sure he does not die of old age. David looked upon Joab as a threat, not only to himself but to Solomon. Joab had control of the army. He also tells him to make sure that Shimei, remember the guy who cursed David and threw rocks at him, will make sure Shimei doesn't die of old age either. After this, David dies and Solomon is established officially as king. Right after this, his brother Adonijah, who doesn't seem to learn, comes to Solomon's mother Bathsheba and asks Solomon that the young woman that laid with David in his old age be given to him. Solomon sees this for what it is, another attempt to take the throne, and he has his brother Adonijah executed. Solomon also exiles the high priest Abiathar, thereby fulfilling the prophecy given clear back in Samuel's day that the house of Eli would be eliminated from the priesthood. Right after this, Solomon has Joab executed because he supported Adonijah. Then he brings in Shimei and puts limits on him, saying that as long as he never leaves town, he will live. But not long after that, he does leave town, chasing one of his slaves, and Solomon has him executed as well. After doing all this, his throne is established. Everyone that needed killing is dead, and there are no challengers left. Solomon, of course, is in the line of the ancestry of Jesus. In chapter 3, we get Solomon's prayer for wisdom. God says, ask for anything, and I'll give it to you. And so Solomon asks for wisdom to lead his people because he's young. God tells him, because you have not asked for wealth or the death of your enemies, but wisdom, I will not only give you wisdom, but everything else as well. Solomon, of course, does exhibit great wisdom in his governing of Israel, growing it into a great nation, keeping the peace with everyone around him. He also wrote most of the book of Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and many of the Psalms themselves. Solomon also builds the temple and his own palace, and he brings the ark into the temple. His building projects were famous throughout the known world of that time. Well, that's kind of it for this week. Next week, we're going to cover 1 Kings chapter 10 to 2 Kings chapter 5. Thank you for joining us on the road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here in Marion, Indiana at St. James, and we will see you next week. Peace out.